I don't take no shit from you, I own you, literally. Hello everybody and welcome back to another brand new episode of Business Blaze. This one, Concorde was bad for business. I was super interested in this. I find the Concorde story really interesting. I hope Danny does too. He wrote the script. Let's dive in and see how we do. On October the 24th, 2003, Concorde took off from New York's JFK Airport and later touched down at Heathrow Airport in London for what proved to be the last ever commercial flight for the supersonic passenger airliner. The farewell flight for the British-French turbojet-powered aircraft was the final chapter in a story spanning 27 years of commercial supersonic flights, and it's fair to say that emotions were mixed. Yeah, I never flew on a Concorde. I did see it fly overhead many times when I was a kid, and it looked really different. It's got kind of a very different silhouette, so that was kind of cool. Concorde was always divided opinion. Many people believe it to be one of mankind's most beautiful feats of engineering and a technological marvel. Yeah, I definitely think so. It's a great looking plane, definitely like commercial supersonic transport. It's something we haven't had for basically 20 years, and we had seemingly well ahead of its time, so I'd say that's pretty great. I used to work with a guy who appeared to worship at the Temple of Concorde, and who actually started welling up when he saw the footage of the final flight. He never got to have a ride in one. He was in the same crap job as me, so it was more likely to travel in one of Ryanair's Boeing 737-800 aircraft. Yes, Concorde was wildly expensive. I had no idea how expensive it was. I swear it's like 10 grand a ticket one way or something just to New York from London. It's like, that's insanely expensive. Maybe Danny will get into all of this, but I think it was like double the price of a first class ticket, which is already like double the price of business, and business is double the price of economy. It was not messing around. But he devoted his spare time to reading books and watching documentaries on what he believed to be the single greatest design of the millennium. I like to think he probably built and painted Airfix models of Concorde too, but he always blushed and changed the subject when I suggested this. It's not that embarrassing, is it? Others were a bit less enthusiastic. To some people, Concorde was just a ridiculously noisy beast with a silly droopy nose that polluted the environment while getting uber wealthy celebrities to their destination a bit quicker than the rest of us. It is true. It was definitely for the elite because it was wildly expensive. It used an absolute ton of fuel. Like, I don't know what, I'm sure Danny will get into just how much more fuel Concorde used than other regular planes. These were the kind of people who were quite relieved to see the back of it. But whatever you're feeling, I couldn't afford to go on Concorde. I still can't afford to go on Concorde, but I don't think I'm happy to see it go. It's insanely cool. But whatever your feelings about Concorde, there's no denying that the demise of the supersonic airliner was certainly an unusual moment in history. We get used to waving a sad goodbye to technology that naturally becomes outdated and replaced by something better. I'm still struggling with the idea of getting rid of my typewriter, but I'm told that I'll save a fortune on Tipex whenever I upgrade to one of those newfangled word processors. Yeah, it's a real hassle because Danny carrier pigeons his scripts over to me. I have to type them up and print them out. It's not convenient. However, in the case of Concorde, there was no replacement. There was nothing better in the pipeline, and that's really important. Like, even today, if you've got, $100 million private jet, you'd still be faster to go by Concorde. Concorde, because none of the private jets currently fly faster than the speed of sound, so yeah, you'd get people traveling on Concorde who would normally fly on a private jet because it just gets you there faster. In 2003, Concorde was the only commercial supersonic aircraft capable of traveling twice the speed of sound and crossing the Atlantic in less than half the time of your bog standard subsonic aircraft. And it still is the only way to travel faster than the speed of sound commercially. It could be argued that we all took a surprising step backward when Concorde was retired after 27 years of service. But what exactly led to the demise of Concorde and the end of supersonic travel? My old work colleague would often lament that Concorde was simply ahead of its time. In some ways, this was literally true. You could catch a Concorde flight from London and technically arrive in New York a couple of hours before you set off. That is so cool. Admittedly, time zone difference rather than any TARDIS-like technology buried deep within the engines is responsible, but still it's pretty impressive. It is insanely impressive. It'd be amazing, like, oh yeah, I've got a meeting at 9 o'clock in New York, so let's aim to leave London at, say, 10 a.m? And I still think you'd be early. It's widely believed that the tragic Air France Concorde crash in Paris in 2000, which claimed 113 lives, ultimately led to the decision to retire the craft a few years later amid growing safety concerns from potential passengers. But while the tragedy certainly may have played a part in turning passengers off the idea of supersonic travel, it's far from the whole story. Yeah, and I mean, this was a tragic, terrible crash. If you've seen the footage of that plane taking off, I think it was taking off, where the engine catches fire, it's pretty intense. But it's not like we don't have plane crashes all the time. And I mean, they're not all the time, but we have regular plane crashes where hundreds of people die. And it's like, we still get on a plane. The truth of the matter is that Concorde was a terrible and frankly unworkable business model right from the very beginning. If I'm right, I think it was paid for by the taxpayer. So it's kind of like, yeah, companies would never make this. Ever since the American flying ace Chuck Yeager became the first man to break the speed of sound in the X-1 Glamorous Glennis over the Mojave Desert in 1947, the race was on for the commercial aviation industry to develop the world's first supersonic aircraft for civilians. Except they didn't really, because obviously it was too expensive. The Soviet Union may have won the race. Oh, I'm glad we get into the Tupolev. This will be fun. The Soviet Union may have won the race, but they were quickly sent home for an early bath. While the Tupolev Tu-144 was the world's first commercial supersonic aircraft, the Rush design was plagued with hundreds of failures, and it was quickly given the chop after just 55 passenger flights. And I swear they made like 20 of these or something. I think there's something really interesting about this that I don't think Danny's going to mention, but I will just look up for you guys. So I'm pretty sure the Tupolev was like famously incredibly loud. So I just brought up its Wikipedia page. Oh yeah, it should also be pointed out that the Tupolev did have one crash. It was only at an air show, but I mean, they flew it 55 times. It crashed once. Can you imagine getting on a plane where it's like, yeah, there's like a slightly less than 2% chance, or 2% of our aircraft have crashed, killing everyone on board. Or like 10% of the aircraft or 2% of all flights. Oh yeah, cabin noise, this is it. A problem for passengers was the very high level of noise inside the cabin, measured at an average of at least 90 to 95 decibels, which is insanely loud. They're gonna get into it. The noise came from the engines and the air conditioning. In addition, the unique active heat insulation system, which used the flow of spent cabin air, was described as excessively noisy. Passengers seated next to each other could have a conversation only with difficulty, and those seated 2 seats apart could not hear each other even when screaming, and had to pass handwritten notes when instead. Noise in the back of the aircraft was unbearable. Alexei Tupolev acknowledged the problem to foreign passengers and promised to fix it, but was never able to do so. So it's like, can you imagine just sitting across the aisle from someone and it's so loud that they can't hear you screaming at them. And there was so much wrong with the Tupolev, it's not even funny. And then they think people are like, yeah, you definitely stole the design, Soviet Union, because here's the Tupolev, here's the Concorde. And even though the Tupolev got to market first, I mean, that's just because it was a piece of The problem faced by the rest of the world was the vast expense. No single country could afford to go supersonic alone. The UK was initially keen to hook up with the US in order to get financing for their developments, but the US didn't fancy playing second fiddle to the UK and instead proceeded with their own research before withdrawing from the game entirely, believing that the idea wasn't commercially viable. They had a good point. Yes, they did, as we will certainly see. The only other country with the finance, technology, and interest in developing commercial supersonic aircraft was France, and somewhat reluctantly, the UK and France eventually agreed to form a partnership to develop the Concorde in 1962. The project was funded by the UK and French governments at an estimated cost of around £70 million, which is £1.4 billion in today's money. £1.4 billion of taxpayer money. Should add. Just a couple of years later, in 1964, members of the UK cabinet were already privately expressing concern and regret over the project as its costs began to spiral out of control. It'd be like, yeah guys, what are we building? We're building a supersonic aircraft for commercial flight. Why? I mean, it's insanely cool, but did no one stop and ask why? Over the next decade, political spats across the channel and unforeseen design problems delayed the development of Concorde and racked up the costs even higher. By the time the supersonic aircraft was ready to take its maiden commercial flights in 1976, the final cost of the project was estimated to have been about £1.2 billion, or at least £8 billion in today's money. That's quite some way over the original budget, and don't forget that all of this was funded by British and French taxpayers. Yes. Before Concorde had even taken to the skies, many were referring to it as a commercial disaster that should have never been started. 20 craft were built, with 14 of them entering airline service. How many of the Tupolevs? I swear there were more Tupolevs. 16, okay, so only a few more. They built 16 and they took 55 flights. That's like 3 per aircraft. And it was insanely expensive. 20 aircraft were built, 14 of them entered service. The other 6 were prototypes, pre-production models, or models just built for a bit of a laugh because they had materials left over. Most of those are now on show in museums. I've never been to see the Concorde. I think there's one in the Air France Museum in France. I'd love to go see that. British Airways and Air France were the only 2 airlines to operate the new craft, and even this was only because they had their arms twisted by their respective governments, who, having ploughed over £1 billion into the project, were now keen to see their fancy new planes in the sky. They're British Airways, guys, we really don't, it's really expensive, it doesn't make business sense, and the government are like, you're gonna be flying that British Airways. I don't take no shit from you, I own you, literally. British Airways were reported to have paid the UK government just £1 for the 7 Concordes that ended up with the airline. Oh, that's really cheap. That's like less than, 15p? But despite the teething issues, Concorde certainly proved to be a big hit with the fabulously wealthy, at least for a while. For the first time, celebrities, rock stars, sporting heroes, politicians, royalty, and whatever Phil Collins is meant to be were able to make short hops across the Atlantic in just a few hours, whilst drinking champagne and stuffing their faces with caviar. If they timed it right, they could even get back home again before the pubs shut. There is a weird but cool video on YouTube of a guy who just filmed I think it was one of the last Concorde flights. So throughout the whole thing, he's just filming. And it's kind of like very like point of view experience of being on the Concorde. It's pretty cool. Naturally, travelling at twice the speed of sound came with a heavy price tag. This wasn't really helped along by the fact that while oil and jet fuel was dead cheap in the 1960s, when Concorde was being developed, the oil crisis of 1973 to 1974 pushed prices up to levels that nobody could have predicted by the time Concorde was in the air. As an example, a round-trip ticket from New York to London in 1997 would cost nearly $13,000 in today's dollars, about 30 times more expensive than alternate flights at the time, and well over twice as much as a nice luxurious first-class seat in a jumbo jet. And yeah, I imagine Danny's gonna get into this, but the problem was people were like, yeah, Concorde's fast, but I could, for like half the price, I could just sleep in a really comfortable bed and eat some nice food in first class. It's pretty nice. And I thought it was $10,000 one way, but it's actually $13,000 both ways. If Concorde was around today, I would do this once because I'd like to travel faster than the speed of sound. And then I'd have to travel economy for the rest of my life. There was a bit of a forgotten... It's as much as a car! There was a bit of a forgotten problem with Concorde. Despite the sky-high ticket prices and the luxurious image, it wasn't particularly comfortable, as it was built for speed rather than luxury, so all these VIP passengers were crammed into quite basic and tight seating. At least the Concorde wasn't insanely loud. Like, the passengers, I've seen the videos, they're not screaming at each other. The speed of the flight was literally everything good about the Concorde, which is fine if you're in a hurry. But many of the filthy rich flyers started to realize over time that they could have a luxurious experience far more deserving of their celebrity status by adding a few more hours to the journey and paying a fraction of the cost for a far more comfortable ride. The noise turned out to be a big problem too. Yeah, I think this is external noise though. The massive sonic boom sounded like a bomb going off, and if you've ever heard a sonic boom, it is goddamn loud. Like, I was hiking once and they do these like military exercises in this like big national park where I was hiking, and this plane's just like, "Pachong!" You're like, hell, that's loud. Yeah. Sonic booms. This meant nobody wanted Concorde flying over their neighborhood, so it was restricted to flying over the ocean. Yeah, like once it could only go supersonic once it was out at sea, because no one wanted, like, you'd just be hanging out in London, a sonic boom. Not great. This meant that it could never fly eastwards to the developing business markets in Asia, as this would involve flying over land, while it also lacked the range to fly westward over the Pacific Ocean. Ultimately, this slapped a huge restriction on where British Airways and France could actually go with Concorde. You'd have thought that one of the biggest potential benefits of supersonic travel would be to dramatically cut down on the time of long-haul flights, but this was never going to be possible, which comes close to making a mockery of the whole idea. Following the tragic Air France crash in Paris in 2000, Concorde was taken out of action for nearly 2 years as $71 million was spent on safety improvements. Just a couple of years after Concorde returned to the skies, it was officially retired in 2003, with the crash taking much of the blame. Oh, it'd be pretty regrettable. You like spend £71 million and then it's like, yeah, we're gonna retire it anyway. But it's closer to the truth to say that Concorde had always been financially unviable. Although British Airways and Air France had reportedly been making a profit from operating the Concorde service, particularly during the 1980s, it's also worth remembering that they never spent a penny on the development in the first place, so they didn't have to worry about recouping any of that £1.2 billion development cost, which was instead absorbed by the British and French governments. And by governments, they mean taxpayers. So it's like, yeah, Concorde was super cool, but it was essentially just a complete business failure because, you know, it was built by the government and then it was taken out of service, and yeah, that sucks. So even at the commercial peak of Concorde, it could never really be considered a business success story, and should read these things ahead. The whole thing had just been more of a decade-long strain on British and French taxpayers. As a workable business concept, it wouldn't have lasted 2 minutes on Dragon's Den, Shark Tank as you Americans call it. By the year 2003, Concorde's high energy consumption pushed ticket prices even higher for a limited and cramped service, which got you over the Atlantic a bit quicker, but at a far higher price tag than luxurious first class. And I'll throw up a picture of like Concorde Concorde's interior. It's it's pretty basic and cramped. It looks more comfortable than like an EasyJet for a short-haul EasyJet flight, but not much more comfortable. The 14 Concordes were also getting a bit old now, and it was costing a fortune to maintain the aged craft, a situation not helped when Airbus, the successors of Concorde's original manufacturers, made the decision to withdraw maintenance support. That's not a million miles away from Microsoft announcing they're discontinuing support that for a software package you only bought last year. It's a big sign that the game's over. And in a world waking up to the reality of climate change, you couldn't avoid the fact that Concorde burned through the same amount of fuel as a Boeing 747. Now that doesn't sound too bad, except the Boeing 747 holds 4 times as many passengers and flies twice as far. Ultimately, Concorde had become completely inefficient at its job. Maybe the real point here is that Concorde was a triumph of design over necessity. It was perhaps an engineer's dream rather than a consumer's dream. Professor Chris Ivory, the deputy director of the Institute for International Management Practice at Anglia Ruskin University, once declared that Concorde was created by engineers who built metal tubes that flew very, very fast and then grudgingly bolted the seats in afterwards. Was Concorde a masterpiece of design? Absolutely. I don't think anyone could disagree with that. But could we build a fleet of them to operate commercial flights at twice the speed of sound? Of course we could. We're Europeans. Was that a good idea? Not really. And certainly not at those silly prices. Yeah, it's insanely fast. It's insanely expensive. It's insanely cool. But it's not going to work out. I'm sorry. Hopefully in the future. Maybe these bonus facts will cover that. One of the longest running spats between the UK and the French was simply the spelling of the name Concorde. Of course, we'd find something to fight over. The French quite liked the idea of the Gaelic E on the end of the name, whereas the UK preferred to drop the E and just spell it as Concorde without the E. It was an argument. It works less great when I read it out loud, because you'd say it exactly the same. It was an argument that rumbled on for several years in the 60s, with each country stubbornly using their own spelling when referring to the development of the craft. It was only towards the end of the decade that the British Minister of Technology, Tony Benn, announced that the UK had caved and adopted the E. Seems like a bit of a waste of the Minister of Technology's time. During its 27-year lifespan, Concorde flew a total of 2.5 million passengers over 50,000 flights. Notable frequent flyers included Elton John, Rod Stewart, Sean Connery, Robert Redford, the Queen, and Pavarotti, who was probably a little more than cramped. Maybe he booked 2 seats. It's only $26,000. Pavarotti can afford it. Concorde's oldest ever passenger was Eva Woodman from Bristol, who was 105 years old at the time. Concorde's most embarrassing passenger ever was Phil Collins, who was about 33. I don't think Phil Collins is that bad, Danny. Do I have a terrible taste in music? There's something in the air. Well, my singing is bad, but Phil Collins isn't bad. That is Phil Collins, right? Are we likely to ever see supersonic commercial flights again? Good. Glad we're touching on this. Probably not in our lifetimes, although Richard Branson has other ideas. Really? I'm 33. I'm 32. I'll be pretty disappointed. I'm gonna live another 50, 60 years? I'm flying supersonic at some point in my life. I don't care what it takes. At some point, I'll just have to go to Russia and pay like 20 grand for someone to take me up on one of those jets. But I'm going supersonic. Following the retirement of Concorde, he initially offered to buy the British Airways fleet for the price of £1. That is such a classic Branson move. The exact same price at which British Airways had purchased them from the UK government 27 years earlier, the offer was declined. He eventually upped his bid to £5 million for the lot, but British Airways refused to sell them, declaring the planes should be retired from service as they were no longer fit for purpose. Well, it's not like he's just going to be able to take them and fly them again. There are regulatory bodies that make sure planes are safe to fly. That sounds like a bit of a dick move. Branson later accused British Airways of committing an act of industrial vandalism. Well, yeah, Branson has a better way with words than I do. In more recent years, Virgin has acquired options to buy a proposed new breed of supersonic planes being developed by American startup company Boom Technology, who have already secured $151 million in funding. I'm not sure if I'd call my supersonic airplane company Boom Technology, seeing as one of the big problems with this original supersonic commercial flight was the sonic boom. But that's why I don't run a $151 million startup company. Nicknamed Son of Concorde, the planes will apparently fly further, more economically, and will be at least 30 times quieter than the original craft. If it ever gets off the ground, let's hope they remember to put in comfy seats this time. Yes, absolutely. I really, really hope they get one of these going before I die, or before I get too old to enjoy it. That would be cool. This has been Business Blaze. Suggestions, if you got them. This was a suggestion from me, actually, but if you've got something you'd like us to cover, let me know in the comments below. Please do subscribe to this channel, hit that thumbs up button, all of that good stuff. And I'll see you next time.